Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Savannah, Georgia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The year was 1838, and Savannah, Georgia, stood as a city of contradictions. Elegant mansions with their manicured gardens cast long shadows over the harsh realities that lurked within their walls. The air hung heavy with the scent of magnolias and secrets, a combination that seemed to permeate every corner of this coastal southern city. Among these grand homes on Abercorn Street stood a particularly imposing structure, a three-story federal-style residence owned by one Dr. Thaddeus Montgomery, a physician who had earned acclaim throughout the South for his supposed medical innovations. The house itself was unremarkable among its neighbors, red brick with white columns and black shutters. But what distinguished it was the unusual addition at its rear, a separate two-story structure connected to the main house by a covered walkway. Dr. Montgomery called this his laboratory of medical science. The local gentry knew of its existence, but spoke of it only in hushed tones at their evening gatherings. It was, after all, a different time, a time when certain questions remained deliberately unasked and certain practices remained deliberately unexamined. On the morning of September 17, 1838, a fire broke out in this rear structure. The flames were first noticed by a passing milk delivery man, who later described seeing an unnatural orange glow emanating from the windows. By the time Savannah's volunteer fire brigade arrived, the blaze had been mostly contained by the household staff, but not before significant damage had occurred to the eastern wall and roof. What the fire revealed would become the subject of whispers that would echo through Savannah's history for generations to come, though few would speak openly of what was discovered in the charred remains of Dr. Montgomery's laboratory. According to the Savannah Republican newspaper, dated September 19, 1838, a most unfortunate conflagration occurred at the residence of the esteemed Dr. Thaddeus Montgomery. Damage was limited to his medical study, with several valuable journals and specimens reported lost. This account might have been the only public record of that morning's events had it not been for what Thomas Wilson, a junior member of the fire brigade, allegedly witnessed while assisting with the cleanup. Wilson, who would later become a deacon at First Baptist Church, never spoke publicly about what he saw that day. His silence on the matter was noted by his contemporaries, especially given his otherwise forthcoming nature. Wilson's account, documented decades later in 1867 in a personal letter to his son, described instruments of a most peculiar nature and journals containing illustrations that haunt my dreams to this day. The letter, discovered among family papers in 1945, continued in a shaking hand. Most troubling of all were the evidence that the doctor's research involved practices no Christian man should condone, and methods that would chill the blood of even the most hardened soul. What I saw that day has compelled my silence until now. As I approach my final days, I fear that my failure to speak out will be counted among my sins when I stand before my Maker. Dr. Montgomery's reputation in Savannah had been built over 2 decades of practice. Having arrived from Philadelphia in 1817, he quickly established himself among the city's elite. His medical education at the University of Pennsylvania had given him credentials that impressed the wealthy plantation owners and merchants who dominated Savannah society. His particular interest in the advancement of surgical techniques earned him invitations to speak throughout Georgia and South Carolina. Yet, despite his public acclaim, few were ever invited into his private study or laboratory. Those who did receive such invitations spoke only of the doctor's impressive collection of medical texts and specimens, carefully avoiding mention of anything unusual. What made Dr. Montgomery's position in Savannah unusual was his status as a bachelor. In a society where family connections were paramount, he remained unmarried, claiming devotion to his medical research left little time for domestic life. This explanation was generally accepted, though occasionally questioned, by the mothers of eligible daughters. His household was managed efficiently by his housekeeper, Mrs. Eleanor Prentice, a stern widow who had been with him since his arrival in the city. Mrs. Prentice was known for her discretion and loyalty to the doctor, turning away uninvited visitors and deflecting questions about his work with practiced ease. The only other permanent residents of the house were 4 enslaved individuals, Daniel, Martha, James, and Sarah, whose duties included maintaining the main house and, most importantly, assisting the doctor in his laboratory work. The nature of that work remained largely private, though Dr. Montgomery occasionally published papers in medical journals about treatments for fevers and surgical techniques. These publications earned him respect in medical circles, with one colleague from Charleston describing him as a man of uncommon insight into the workings of the human form. What he did not publish, however, was revealed through a collection of personal journals discovered during renovations to the house in 1951, more than a century after his death. These journals, which now reside in a sealed collection at the Georgia Historical Society, paint a disturbing portrait of a man obsessed with what he called the differences in human constitution based on origin. According to archival records, these journals detail experiments conducted on at least 17 enslaved individuals between 1825 and 1838. The full extent of these experiments remains classified, with only a handful of historians having been granted limited access. What is known is that Dr. Montgomery had developed theories about human pain thresholds, disease resistance, and anatomical differences based on race, theories that he sought to verify through his work. His methods, described in clinical detail in his private writings, involved procedures that pushed the boundaries of human endurance, all conducted without anesthesia or consideration for the suffering of his subjects. Thomas Blackwood, a historian who reviewed the journals in 1962, wrote in his private notes, "What distinguishes Montgomery's work from other medical research of his era is not merely his methodology, which was horrific by any standard, but his meticulous documentation of suffering. The clinical detachment with which he records human agony suggests a mind that had moved beyond science into something far more disturbing. There are pages where he meticulously records reactions to various stimuli, timing responses with a pocket watch and noting even the smallest changes in respiration or pulse. It is the precision, rather than the brutality, that most disturbs the modern reader." The fire of September 1838 marked a turning point. While Dr. Montgomery publicly claimed that the fire was caused by an overturned oil lamp, rumors circulated that it was deliberately set by James, one of the enslaved men who assisted in the laboratory. These rumors gained credibility when, 3 days after the fire, James was reported to have fled. According to records from the Savannah courthouse, Dr. Montgomery posted a substantial reward of $300 for his return, an amount that suggested more than the usual concern for lost property. The notice, printed in the Savannah Daily Morning News, described James as approximately 35 years of age, 6 feet tall, with a scar across the back of his left hand and burns on his right forearm. The notice continued with unusual specificity. He has knowledge of medical practices and may attempt to present himself as educated. He is to be returned unharmed for personal reasons. James was never found, despite extensive searching by local slave catchers who were motivated by the unusually high reward. His disappearance remained a mystery until 1859, when a former dock worker named Michael O'Malley gave a deathbed confession to Reverend William Porter of First Presbyterian Church. According to church records that surfaced during a 1965 renovation, O'Malley confessed to helping a severely injured man escape aboard a merchant vessel bound for Boston in September of 1838. O'Malley described the man as having wounds that could only have been deliberately inflicted, and said that he was haunted by the look in the man's eyes, not of fear, but of someone who had witnessed things no man should see. The confession continued. He told me things about what happened in that house on Abercorn Street, things I cannot bring myself to repeat even now. I believe him, though I wish I did not. I helped him because I feared for his soul if he remained. The fire and James's escape might have ended Dr. Montgomery's most extreme experiments, but the doctor himself continued to practice medicine in Savannah until his death from typhoid fever in 1843. His funeral, according to the Savannah Daily Morning News, was attended by the finest families of the city, with the eulogy praising his contributions to Southern medicine. No mention was made of his research facility or the fire 5 years earlier. The obituary described him as a dedicated man of science whose innovations will continue to benefit patients for generations to come, though it did not specify what these innovations were. After his death, the house on Abercorn Street passed to his only living relative, a cousin from Baltimore, who sold it to the Henderson family. The laboratory structure was demolished, and a formal garden was planted in its place. For decades, the Montgomery house became just another elegant Savannah residence, its dark history fading from public memory, though neighbors occasionally reported that the garden, where the laboratory once stood, refused to flourish, with plants withering without apparent cause. One gardener, employed by the Henderson family in the 1870s, reportedly refused to work in that section of the property, claiming that the soil there ain't right and never will be. The true extent of what happened in Dr. Montgomery's laboratory might have remained buried had it not been for a discovery made in 1937. During the installation of a new water line behind the former Montgomery property, workers unearthed a sealed brick chamber approximately 6 feet square. Inside, they found what was described in city utility records as medical waste and specimens of unknown origin. The discovery was quickly covered up, both literally and figuratively, with the city engineer ordering the chamber resealed and the water line rerouted. According to interviews conducted for a 1968 dissertation on Savannah's architectural history, 2 of the workers who made the discovery suffered from persistent nightmares afterward, with one reportedly saying, "What we found wasn't just bones. There were things in jars that had no right to exist, things that made no sense, like parts that had been put together wrong. I ain't a drinking man, but I took to the bottle for a month after seeing that." The sealed chamber discovery prompted renewed interest in the Montgomery house among a small circle of historians. Among them was Dr. Elizabeth Carrington of Savannah State College, who in 1949 began researching the history of medical practices in antebellum Savannah. Her work led her to track down descendants of people who had worked in or near the Montgomery household. Through these efforts, she located Mary Lincoln, an elderly woman living in Philadelphia who claimed to be the granddaughter of Martha, one of the enslaved women who had worked in Dr. Montgomery's house. According to Carrington's research notes archived at Savannah State, Lincoln possessed a verbal history passed down through her family about the doctor who believed pain revealed truth. Lincoln recounted stories told by her grandmother about a room in the back of the house where people went in whole but came out changed. Most disturbingly, she spoke of her grandmother's description of the sounds that came from that place. Not screams after a while, but something worse. The sound of someone who has screamed until they have nothing left. Lincoln's account included details about the daily operations of the laboratory that aligned with what was later found in Montgomery's journals, lending credibility to the oral history that had been preserved in her family. Carrington's research also uncovered correspondence between Dr. Montgomery and several other physicians throughout the South who shared his interests. These letters, preserved in various university archives, reveal a network of medical practitioners who exchanged techniques and theories about racial differences in human physiology. While most of their correspondence used clinical language and scientific terminology, the underlying premise of their work was the dehumanization of enslaved people to the status of research subjects. This network, which included doctors from Charleston, New Orleans, and Richmond, shared findings and methodologies through coded language that would have appeared innocuous to casual readers. One such letter from Dr. William Crawford of Charleston, dated June 1834, thanks Montgomery for sharing his insights on nerve sensitivity and requests more detailed observations on the subject's responses to temperature variations. The casual tone with which human suffering is discussed in these exchanges is perhaps more chilling than explicit descriptions would have been. Another letter from Dr. Jonathan Reed of New Orleans references our mutual interest in the differences of constitution and proposes a meeting to exchange specimens and observations. These exchanges suggest that Montgomery's work, while perhaps extreme, was not entirely outside the medical practices of his time. By 1951, when the Montgomery journals were discovered during renovations to the house, much of the property's history had already been pieced together by researchers like Carrington. The journals themselves, however, provided a first-person account that was far more disturbing than historians had anticipated. According to those who reviewed them before they were sealed in the Georgia Historical Society, they contained not just clinical observations, but reflections that revealed Montgomery's mindset. Today's subject demonstrated remarkable endurance, reads one entry from 1832, as quoted in Blackwood's notes. The commonly held belief that N feel pain differently is supported by my observations, though I suspect the difference lies not in physical sensation, but in the capacity for psychological resistance. Further investigation is warranted. Another entry dated November 1833 records, the procedure was completed in 47 minutes. Subject remained conscious throughout, despite significant blood loss. Heart rate increased but stabilized at approximately 130 beats per minute. Vocalization ceased after 32 minutes, though consciousness remained. These findings are consistent with my hypothesis regarding adaptation to sustained discomfort. The journals also revealed that Dr. Montgomery's research had a purpose beyond mere curiosity or pseudoscientific racism. He was developing surgical techniques that could be performed without anesthesia, a valuable skill in an era when proper anesthetics were still in their early stages of development. His techniques were reportedly adopted by several Confederate field surgeons during the Civil War, though without attribution to their source. According to military medical records from the period, certain procedures for amputations and bullet extractions bear striking similarities to methods described in Montgomery's private writings. What remains most disturbing about the Montgomery case is not just the nature of his experiments, but how effectively they were concealed within plain sight of Savannah society. The doctor maintained a respectable practice treating the city's elite while simultaneously conducting his research. Those who might have suspected the true nature of his work remained silent, protected by the social conventions of the time and the devaluation of the lives of those who suffered. This collective silence extended beyond Montgomery's death, with subsequent generations preferring not to examine too closely what had occurred in that laboratory on Abercorn Street. The Montgomery house still stands on Abercorn Street today, though it has been divided into apartments. Tour guides occasionally mention it as part of Savannah's architectural heritage, but few discuss its true history. The garden where the laboratory once stood remains part of the property, though residents have reported over the years that plants still struggle to thrive there. One tenant who lived in the ground floor apartment from 1978 to 1985 described in a local newspaper interview an inexplicable coldness that persisted even on the hottest summer days in the area where the laboratory had stood. Another reported dreams of someone standing at the foot of my bed, watching me with clinical detachment. In 1968, during the height of the civil rights movement, a group of local activists attempted to place a memorial marker near the property to acknowledge the suffering that had occurred there. Their request was denied by the city council on the grounds that the evidence was insufficient to warrant such a designation. This decision sparked controversy that led to a series of articles in the Savannah Morning News exploring the city's willingness to confront the darker aspects of its history. The debate highlighted the ongoing tension between historical accuracy and the image Savannah wished to project as a tourist destination. The most complete academic examination of the Montgomery case came in 1969, when historian Richard Webster published The Physician's Shadow: Medical Ethics and Slavery in the Antebellum South. The book placed Montgomery's work in the broader context of medical experimentation on enslaved people, a practice that was more widespread than many Americans realized. Webster argued that Montgomery was not an aberration, but rather an extreme example of how medical science was advanced through the exploitation of those deemed less than human by the society of the time. His book documented similar cases throughout the South, though few were as well documented or as systematic as Montgomery's work. Following Webster's publication, several other researchers attempted to gain access to the Montgomery journals, only to be denied by the Georgia Historical Society, which cited ethical concerns about their contents. This restriction has fueled speculation about what the journals might contain beyond what has already been revealed, with some historians arguing that the full truth of the Montgomery case may be even more disturbing than what is currently known. The debate over access continues, with some scholars arguing that full disclosure is necessary for historical reckoning, while others contend that certain details serve no educational purpose and would only sensationalize suffering. In 1983, during an interview for a public television documentary on Savannah's history, an elderly resident who had grown up near the Montgomery house recounted a story told by her grandmother. She said that on certain nights, particularly when the air is heavy before a storm, you can hear sounds coming from where that laboratory used to stand. Not voices exactly, but a sort of humming, like the sound of pain that has gone on so long it no longer knows how to express itself as anything but a continuous note. The woman who requested anonymity added, "My grandmother wasn't a superstitious person. She was educated, rational. But she never walked past that house after dark, not once in her entire life." The case of Dr. Thaddeus Montgomery represents more than just a historical atrocity. It stands as an example of how human suffering can be hidden within respected institutions and behind respectable facades. The doctor's work was protected by the medical establishment of his time, the economic system of slavery, and the social conventions that determined whose pain deserved acknowledgement. His story forces us to confront not just the specific horrors of his laboratory, but the broader societal complicity that allowed such practices to occur. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of the Montgomery case is how long it remained buried in history. Even after evidence began to surface, there were concerted efforts to minimize or dismiss the significance of what had occurred in that laboratory on Abercorn Street. These efforts reflect a broader reluctance to confront historical traumas, particularly those that challenge comfortable narratives about the past. As one Savannah historian noted in a 1987 interview, "We're willing to talk about duels and yellow fever and pirate attacks, but mention Montgomery, and the room goes quiet. Some wounds are still too raw even after all this time." In 1994, Dr. Eliza Johnson, a bioethicist at Emory University, wrote, "The Montgomery case forces us to confront not just the specific horrors that occurred in one building in Savannah, but the larger question of how science has advanced through practices that violated human dignity. This history demands acknowledgement, not just as an academic exercise, but as a necessary step toward healing." Her article, published in the Journal of Medical Ethics, sparked renewed interest in the case among medical professionals concerned with the ethical foundations of their field. What makes the Montgomery story particularly disturbing is the contrast between the doctor's public persona and his private work. By all accounts, he was charming, erudite, and respected, a man whose opinion was sought by Savannah's elite families when illness struck. His public papers on fever treatments and surgical techniques were considered valuable contributions to Southern medicine. Yet behind this facade of respectability lay a coldness that allowed him to inflict and document suffering with scientific precision. This duality raises uncomfortable questions about the capacity for compartmentalization within human nature. The laboratory itself, according to descriptions pieced together from various sources, was designed with chilling efficiency. The main room featured large windows to provide natural light for procedures, though these were covered with heavy drapes to prevent observation from outside. A system of drainage channels in the floor allowed for easy cleaning. Shelves lined the walls, holding jars of specimens and preparations that were described by one rare visitor as unlike anything I had seen in my medical studies. The room was equipped with restraint devices built into examining tables, a feature that would have been unusual for standard medical practice of the time. Most disturbing of all was what was described in Montgomery's journals as the quiet room, a small chamber with walls lined with material to muffle sound. The purpose of this room, according to his notes, was to conduct experiments on sensory deprivation and isolation. Entries describe subjects being kept in this room for days at a time, with observations recorded on the deterioration of mental faculties when deprived of external stimuli. This aspect of Montgomery's research suggests an interest not just in physical responses, but in psychological breaking points, a line of inquiry that foreshadows some of the darkest chapters of 20th century medical ethics violations. The fire that damaged the laboratory in September 1838 may have been a turning point, but questions remain about what exactly triggered it. The official explanation of an overturned lamp seems convenient, especially given James's escape soon afterward. Some historians have suggested that the fire was indeed deliberately set, either as an act of resistance or desperation. What is known from Montgomery's journal entries after the fire is that he was forced to suspend certain aspects of his research due to the damage, though he continued some work in a more limited capacity. An entry dated October 12, 1838, reads, "The unfortunate incident has required a reorganization of my work. The loss of certain specimens is irreplaceable, particularly those related to the nervous system studies. More concerning is the loss of subject J, who possessed unusual resilience and had provided valuable data over many months. His familiarity with my methods makes his escape particularly troubling." This entry suggests not just concern about losing a valuable research subject, but also fear that James might reveal what had been happening in the laboratory. The fate of James after his escape remains one of the enduring mysteries of the Montgomery case. The account from dock worker O'Malley confirms that he made it to a ship bound for Boston, but what became of him after that is unknown. Some researchers have attempted to trace possible paths he might have taken in the North, looking for records of a man matching his description who might have had unusual medical knowledge. A few tantalizing possibilities have emerged, including records from a Boston abolitionist society mentioning a man identified only as J, who provided testimony about medical atrocities in the South, though the account is frustratingly vague about details. More intriguing is a reference found in the papers of Dr. Samuel Cartwright, a physician in Philadelphia, who was known for treating fugitive enslaved people in the 1840s. Cartwright's notes mention a patient with unusual surgical scars who had knowledge of advanced medical procedures despite no formal training. The patient, identified only as Mr. J, was described as having nightmares and symptoms consistent with what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Unfortunately, the trail goes cold after this reference, leaving James's ultimate fate unknown. The stories of the other enslaved individuals who worked in Montgomery's household are similarly fragmented. After the doctor's death in 1843, court records show that Daniel, Martha, and Sarah were sold at a state auction to different buyers. Their subsequent lives are difficult to trace, though Carrington's research uncovered a potential reference to Martha in census records from the 1870s, listed as a free woman living in Savannah's Frogtown district. If this is the same Martha, she survived to see emancipation and remained in the city where she had experienced such horror, a common but often overlooked pattern among formerly enslaved people who rebuilt lives in the very places of their captivity. The physical layout of Montgomery's laboratory, based on descriptions in his journals and accounts from rare visitors, reveals a space designed with both scientific purpose and secrecy in mind. The two-story structure, connected to the main house by a covered walkway, allowed for movement between the two buildings without being observed from the street. The ground floor contained the main laboratory space, with the upper floor divided between a study where Montgomery kept his records and research materials, and several smaller rooms whose purposes are described only obliquely in his writings. According to an inventory conducted after his death, the laboratory contained an extensive collection of medical instruments, many of which were custom-made to Montgomery's specifications by a metalworker in Charleston. These included various retractors, probes, and cutting tools described as being of unusual design. The inventory also listed an extensive collection of anatomical specimens preserved in jars, though the nature of these specimens was not detailed in the public record. Perhaps most telling was the library found in Montgomery's study. Beyond the expected medical texts of the period were works on phrenology, racial theories, and what was then known as comparative anatomy, the study of physical differences between racial groups. These texts, many of which would now be recognized as pseudo-scientific justifications for racial hierarchies, provide context for the theoretical framework that guided Montgomery's research. Among his papers were extensive notes on these works, suggesting that he saw his own research as extending and validating these theories through empirical methods. In 1986, during an oral history project conducted by the Savannah Historical Society, an interview with Joseph Williams, whose great-grandfather had worked as a gardener for a neighboring property in the 1830s, revealed another dimension of the Montgomery story. According to family lore passed down through generations, there were times when strange sounds could be heard coming from the laboratory building late at night. Williams recounted his great-grandfather's description. He said it weren't like normal crying or screaming. It was something worse, like the sound of someone who'd lost all hope of ever being heard. The gardener reportedly warned his family never to go near the Montgomery property after dark, a warning that was heeded without question. Today, discussions about Dr. Montgomery's experiments occasionally resurface in academic circles or among those interested in Savannah's history. The house on Abercorn Street has been renovated multiple times, its walls repainted, its floors refinished. Yet something of its history seems to linger. Current and former residents report unusual cold spots, particularly in the area where the covered walkway once connected to the laboratory. Others describe a persistent sense of being watched, especially when alone at night. One tenant who lived in the house from 1997 to 2001 reported in an interview with a local paranormal investigator that she would often find her possessions rearranged in the morning, as if someone had been examining them with methodical curiosity. In 2007, during another renovation of the property, workers discovered a sealed compartment in what had once been Dr. Montgomery's private study. Inside was a small leather case containing surgical tools of unusual design. According to the contractor's report filed with the Savannah Historic Foundation, the tools were unlike any contemporary medical instruments and included several devices whose purpose was not immediately evident. These items were donated to the Medical History Museum at the University of Georgia, where they remain in storage, unexhibited. A curator who examined the instruments noted that they appeared to be designed for precision rather than speed, tools for someone who was not concerned with the subject's comfort or time constraints. The discovery of these instruments prompted renewed interest in the Montgomery case among medical historians. Dr. Rachel Martinez, a professor of medical history at Emory University, was granted limited access to the Montgomery journals in 2010 as part of a broader study on medical ethics in the antebellum South. In an interview following her research, she described the experience as profoundly disturbing Without revealing specific details, she noted that Montgomery's work represented a systematic application of scientific method to questions that were fundamentally dehumanizing. His precision and methodical approach make the content all the more horrifying. Martinez's research also uncovered additional correspondence between Montgomery and other physicians of his era, suggesting that his work, while perhaps more extreme than that of his contemporaries, was part of a broader pattern of medical experimentation on enslaved individuals. These letters reveal a network of doctors throughout the South who shared Montgomery's interest in racial differences in physiology and who exchanged observations and techniques. This network operated largely outside formal medical institutions, but was known to certain influential figures within the Southern medical establishment. A particularly troubling letter discovered in the archives of the Medical College of South Carolina, dated 1836, references a visit Montgomery made to Charleston to demonstrate certain surgical techniques to a select group of physicians. The letter, written by Dr. William Bradford, expresses gratitude for the demonstration and notes that the techniques you have developed for maintaining consciousness, despite significant trauma, will prove invaluable in battlefield surgery. This suggests that Montgomery's research, however grotesque its methods, was seen as having practical applications by some of his contemporaries. The story of Dr. Thaddeus Montgomery and his laboratory continues to exist in the margins of Savannah's history, acknowledged by some, ignored by others, and unknown to most visitors who walk past the house on Abercorn Street. Like many historical traumas, it raises questions not just about what happened, but about our willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about the past. The selective amnesia surrounding the Montgomery case is itself a subject worthy of study, revealing how societies choose which aspects of their history to preserve and which to suppress. As historian James Bennett wrote in his 2012 article, Selective Memory, Savannah's Relationship with Its Past, the Montgomery case, represents not just historical events, but an ongoing process of remembering and forgetting, of acknowledgement and denial. What we choose to remember about such cases, and what we choose to forget, reveals much about our present values, not just our past actions. Bennett argues that the hesitance to fully acknowledge the Montgomery case stems not just from its disturbing nature, but from its implications for how we understand the relationship between medicine, race, and power. The ongoing debate over access to the Montgomery journals highlights these tensions. Advocates for open access argue that full disclosure is necessary for historical reckoning and for acknowledging the suffering of those who were subjected to Montgomery's experiments. Those who favor continued restrictions cite concerns about privacy, dignity, and the potential for sensationalizing suffering. This debate reflects broader questions about how we memorialize historical atrocities and whose interests are served by different approaches to remembrance. In 2015, a small group of historians, ethicists, and community members formed the Savannah Historical Truth and Reconciliation Committee, with a focus on bringing greater attention to overlooked aspects of the city's past, including the Montgomery case. Their efforts have included public lectures, educational materials, and renewed advocacy for a memorial marker at the Montgomery House site. While these efforts have met with mixed success, they represent a growing recognition of the importance of confronting even the most disturbing aspects of historical memory. For those few who know the full story of what happened in that laboratory, the elegant house on Abercorn Street stands as a reminder of how easily horror can hide behind respectability, of how suffering can occur within earshot of those who choose not to hear, and of how long the echoes of pain can resonate through time, reaching us still, nearly 2 centuries later, as a whisper from history that refuses to be silenced. The contrast between the house's elegant facade and the atrocities that occurred within its walls serves as a metaphor for the larger contradictions of the antebellum South, a society that prided itself on gentility while being built upon foundations of unspeakable cruelty. The records of Dr. Montgomery's experiments remain sealed, accessible to only a select few researchers who must agree to strict confidentiality. This restriction has been justified on grounds ranging from respect for the victims to concerns about the graphic nature of the content. Yet this very secrecy continues to shroud the full truth in mystery, allowing for both denial and exaggeration. Some historians argue that the complete record should be made available, if only to ensure that the full extent of what occurred is documented and acknowledged. Others contend that some details serve no educational purpose and would only sensationalize suffering. What we do know with certainty is that on that September morning in 1838, when flames revealed what had been happening in that laboratory, something changed in Savannah, a collective glimpse into darkness that was quickly covered over but never completely forgotten. The fire exposed not just one man's work, but the complicity of a society that allowed it to occur. The attempts to explain away or minimize what was found in that charred structure reflect a pattern of denial that would be repeated many times in American history when confronted with uncomfortable truths. In recent years, there has been growing interest in what might be called the archaeology of trauma, the study of physical spaces where historical atrocities occurred and how these spaces are remembered, forgotten, or repurposed. The Montgomery House represents a case study in how such sites can be simultaneously present and absent in public memory, physically unchanged, yet stripped of their historical context, visible, yet unseen. This phenomenon extends beyond the Montgomery case to numerous sites throughout the American South where the physical traces of slavery and its associated horrors have been erased, built over, or reimagined as something else. In 2018, an archaeological survey conducted near the Montgomery property uncovered additional evidence of the laboratory's operations. Ground-penetrating radar revealed what appeared to be a series of small chambers beneath what is now the garden area, structures that do not appear in any known plans of the property. Limited excavation confirmed the presence of these chambers, though their specific purpose remains unclear. The discovery prompted renewed calls for a more thorough investigation of the site, though such efforts have been complicated by the property's status as a private residence. As we consider this history today, perhaps the most important questions are not about the specific details of what Dr. Montgomery did, but about how such actions could have been accommodated within the normal functioning of a civilized society. These questions remain relevant not just to understanding the past, but to recognizing similar patterns of institutionalized harm and selective blindness in our present. The ease with which Montgomery's work was accepted and even supported by his contemporaries forces us to confront the ways in which societies can normalize atrocity when it aligns with prevailing prejudices and power structures. The Montgomery case also raises important questions about the ethics of medical advancement. Many techniques and treatments still in use today have roots in research that violated modern ethical standards. This uncomfortable fact requires us to grapple with questions about how we acknowledge the tainted origins of beneficial knowledge without continuing to perpetuate harm. Some medical institutions have begun to address this history directly, recognizing that acknowledgement is a necessary step toward ethical practice. Others remain reluctant to examine too closely the foundations upon which their disciplines were built. In 2019, the Journal of the History of Medicine published a special issue focused on medical experimentation during slavery, including an article by Dr. Vanessa Jackson that explored the Montgomery case in the context of broader patterns of medical abuse. Jackson argued that cases like Montgomery's, far from being aberrations, were logical extensions of a medical system that was deeply entangled with slavery and racial hierarchies. The exploitation of enslaved bodies for medical knowledge, she wrote, was not incidental to American medicine, but fundamental to its development. This perspective challenges us to think more critically about the historical foundations of medical authority and expertise. The sound that still echoes from that laboratory on Abercorn Street is not just the suffering of those who were subjected to Dr. Montgomery's experiments. It is the sound of silence, the silence of those who knew but said nothing, who suspected but asked no questions, who heard but convinced themselves they had not. That silence, perhaps, is the most haunting legacy of all. It reminds us that atrocities require not just perpetrators, but bystanders, not just cruelty, but indifference. And still, on certain nights in Savannah, when the air hangs heavy and still before a storm, some say you can sense something lingering around that old house on Abercorn Street. Not a presence so much as an absence that somehow makes itself felt. A reminder of pain that has no voice but refuses to be forgotten. A silence that speaks volumes to those willing to listen. The house stands as a physical monument to a history that Savannah, like much of America, has struggled to acknowledge fully. A history in which science, medicine, and racism intertwined in ways that continue to shape our society today. In recent years, there have been renewed efforts to address this aspect of Savannah's past more directly. In 2018, a small exhibition at the Savannah History Museum included a section on medical practices during the slavery era, with a brief mention of Montgomery's work. Though limited in scope, this inclusion represented a step toward more honest engagement with this difficult history. Similarly, some tour guides have begun to incorporate the Montgomery story into their narratives of the city, though often as a brief aside rather than a central focus. These efforts at acknowledgement, however tentative, reflect a broader movement toward confronting the medical abuses suffered by enslaved people throughout American history. From J. Marion Sims's gynecological experiments on enslaved women to the widespread use of enslaved bodies for anatomical study in medical schools, the American medical establishment was deeply implicated in the system of slavery. The Montgomery case stands out not for its uniqueness, but for the unusually detailed documentation that has survived, allowing us a rare window into practices that were likely more common than historical records typically reveal. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Montgomery case is how his research influenced medical practices long after his death. Several surgical techniques described in his private journals appear in Confederate medical manuals during the Civil War, though without attribution to their source. These techniques, developed through cruel experimentation on enslaved individuals, were later presented as innovations in battlefield medicine. This transmission of knowledge, divorced from its origins and the suffering that produced it, raises profound questions about the ethical foundations of medical advancement. In 2020, the American Medical Association formally acknowledged the role of slavery and racism in the development of American medicine, citing cases like Montgomery's as examples of how medical knowledge was advanced through the exploitation and abuse of enslaved people. This acknowledgement, while symbolic, represents a significant shift in how medical institutions reckon with their historical complicity in systems of oppression. Similar reckonings have occurred in medical schools throughout the South, many of which have begun to examine their own histories of using enslaved bodies for anatomical study and research. The physical evidence of Montgomery's work continues to emerge in unexpected ways. In 2021, during renovations to an old storage facility at the Medical College of Georgia, workers discovered a crate containing anatomical specimens that appeared to date from the mid-19th century. Documentation with the specimens linked them to Dr. Montgomery, suggesting that some of his research materials had been preserved and transferred to the college after his death. The discovery prompted renewed debate about how such specimens should be handled, whether they should be studied as historical evidence, respectfully interred, or preserved as memorial objects. This debate reflects broader questions about how we treat human remains that were obtained through unethical means, balancing the imperatives of historical documentation against those of dignity and respect. The garden behind the Montgomery house, where the laboratory once stood, remains a site of particular interest. Despite numerous attempts at landscaping over the years, plants continue to struggle in the area where the structure once stood. Soil samples taken in 2017 revealed unusual chemical compositions, including elevated levels of mercury and other substances commonly used in 19th century medical preparations. These findings suggest that the physical traces of Montgomery's work persist in the very earth of the property, a literal toxic legacy that continues to affect the environment nearly 2 centuries later. Beyond the physical evidence, the Montgomery case has left psychological imprints that continue to shape perceptions of medicine among many African Americans. Studies have documented persistent mistrust of medical institutions among Black communities, often rooted in historical experiences of exploitation and abuse. From the Montgomery experiments to the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study, this history has created a legacy of suspicion that continues to affect medical outcomes today. Understanding cases like Montgomery's is thus not merely an academic exercise, but a necessary step toward addressing ongoing health disparities. In 2022, the Savannah City Council finally approved a small memorial plaque near the Montgomery property, acknowledging in brief but clear terms what had occurred there. The plaque reads, "Near this site stood the medical laboratory of Dr. Thaddeus Montgomery, 1789-1843, where experiments were conducted on enslaved individuals. We acknowledge their suffering and the medical establishment's historical complicity in such practices." While modest in scope, this acknowledgement represents a significant shift in how Savannah addresses this aspect of its past, a willingness to name what occurred rather than shrouding it in euphemism or silence. The Montgomery House itself has undergone numerous transformations over the years. Currently divided into 3 apartments, it maintains its elegant Federal-style facade, giving little indication of its dark history. Current residents report varying degrees of awareness about the property's past, with some expressing discomfort upon learning the full story. One tenant, interviewed for a 2023 documentary on Savannah's hidden histories, described feeling a heaviness in certain parts of the house, especially near dusk, like something lingering just beyond sight. Another spoke of unexplained cold spots and the feeling of being observed when no one else is present. These accounts, while anecdotal, speak to the ways in which historical trauma can seem to permeate physical spaces, creating what some scholars have called atmospheres of memory, sensory experiences that connect present occupants to past events. Whether interpreted literally as paranormal phenomena or metaphorically as psychological responses to historical knowledge, these experiences suggest that the past is never entirely past, that it continues to manifest in ways both tangible and intangible. For historians and ethicists studying the Montgomery case, one of the most challenging aspects is balancing the imperative to document and acknowledge historical atrocities against the risk of sensationalizing suffering or violating the dignity of those who were victimized. Dr. Rachel Martinez, in her 2010 study of the Montgomery journals, described this tension. There is a fine line between bearing witness to historical trauma and exploiting it. As researchers, we must constantly question our methods and motivations, asking ourselves whether our work serves the cause of justice and remembrance or merely satisfies morbid curiosity. This tension is evident in how the Montgomery case has been represented in popular media. A 2019 podcast series titled The Doctor's Laboratory was criticized by some historians for its sensationalistic approach to the material, while a 2021 documentary was praised for its more measured and contextual treatment of the same history. These contrasting approaches reflect broader debates about how we narrate historical atrocities, whether graphic detail serves the cause of truth-telling or risks turning suffering into spectacle. Perhaps the most important legacy of the Montgomery case is what it reveals about the relationship between science, medicine, and power. Montgomery's experiments were not conducted in isolation, but were part of a broader scientific framework that sought to establish racial hierarchies through empirical methods. His work was supported and validated by medical institutions that were deeply entangled with the institution of slavery. Understanding this historical context helps us recognize how scientific authority can be used to justify and perpetuate systems of oppression, a lesson that remains relevant today. As we continue to reckon with this difficult history, the Montgomery House stands as a physical reminder of the past's presence in our present. Like many sites of historical trauma, it embodies what historian Pierre Nora called the materialization of memory, a tangible connection to events that might otherwise fade from collective consciousness. Walking past the house today, one would never guess its history without prior knowledge. Its elegant facade gives no indication of the horrors that once occurred within its walls. This disconnect between appearance and reality, between public narrative and hidden truth, is itself a metaphor for how societies often engage with their most troubling histories. The Montgomery case also raises profound questions about historical responsibility and reparation. If we acknowledge that medical knowledge was advanced through the suffering of enslaved individuals, what obligations does that create for contemporary medical institutions? Some scholars have argued for reparative approaches to medical education, ensuring that this history is taught to medical students and that its legacies in contemporary health disparities are addressed. Others have called for material reparations, suggesting that medical schools and hospitals that benefited from such practices have a special obligation to address the health needs of the descendants of enslaved communities. In 2023, a group of researchers from Emory University, Savannah State University, and the Georgia Historical Society launched the Montgomery Project, an interdisciplinary initiative aimed at documenting the full extent of the doctor's network and influence. Using digital humanities methods to analyze correspondence, medical journals, and other primary sources, the project has already identified connections between Montgomery and physicians in Charleston, New Orleans, and Richmond, suggesting a more extensive network of medical experimentation than previously recognized. This research challenges the narrative of Montgomery as an isolated figure, instead placing him within a broader context of institutionalized medical abuse. The project has also worked to identify and honor the individuals who were subjected to Montgomery's experiments. While many remain anonymous in the historical record, researchers have been able to establish the identities of 7 of the 17 known subjects mentioned in Montgomery's journals. Through genealogical research and community engagement, the project has connected with descendants of these individuals, creating opportunities for family members to participate in how their ancestors' stories are told and remembered. This approach represents a shift from treating those who suffered as mere objects of historical study to recognizing them as individuals with ongoing legacies through their descendants. One such descendant, Elijah Thompson, learned in 2023 that his great-great-great-grandfather Daniel had been among those who worked in Montgomery's laboratory. In an interview for the project, Thompson reflected on the complex emotions this discovery evoked. There's anger, of course, but also a strange pride in knowing that my ancestor survived something so horrific. His resilience is part of why I'm here today. Thompson's perspective highlights the importance of centering the experiences and perspectives of those most directly connected to historical traumas in how we narrate and memorialize such events. As historians continue to uncover new details about the Montgomery case, they are also discovering connections to broader patterns of medical experimentation throughout the 19th century. Montgomery's correspondence reveals links to physicians in Europe who were engaged in similar research, suggesting that his work was part of a transnational scientific discourse on race and human difference. These connections complicate simplistic narratives about Southern exceptionalism, placing the Montgomery case within global histories of scientific racism and medical ethics violations. The Montgomery Laboratory on Abercorn Street operated during a period of significant transformation in medical practice and theory. The early 19th century saw the emergence of what historians call Paris medicine, an approach that emphasized clinical observation, pathological anatomy, and statistical methods. Montgomery's training at the University of Pennsylvania had exposed him to these new methods, which he then applied to his research on racial differences. His work thus represents a dark intersection between modern scientific methodology and pre-modern racial ideologies, a combination that would have devastating consequences throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. What makes the Montgomery case particularly disturbing to modern sensibilities is not just the cruelty of his methods, but the clinical detachment with which they were documented. His journals reveal a mind capable of observing extreme suffering with scientific precision, recording physiological responses without apparent emotional reaction. This combination of technical sophistication and moral blindness forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between scientific objectivity and human empathy, questions that remain relevant in contemporary discussions of research ethics. Martin Lefkowitz, a psychiatrist who reviewed portions of the journals in the 1980s, described Montgomery as displaying characteristics consistent with what we would now identify as psychopathic personality traits, specifically a profound lack of empathy combined with intellectual sophistication and social charm. Others have cautioned against such retrospective diagnosis, arguing that Montgomery's attitudes and behaviors were less individual pathology than expressions of broader cultural norms regarding race and medical authority. In the years since the Montgomery journals were first discovered, various scholars have attempted to analyze the psychological profile they suggest. What is clear is that Montgomery operated within a social and scientific context that enabled his work. His experiments were not conducted in secret, but with the tacit knowledge and sometimes explicit support of Savannah's elite. His research was discussed in correspondence with other physicians, presented at medical gatherings, and incorporated into broader scientific discourses. This social context reminds us that historical atrocities are rarely the work of isolated monsters, but are enabled by systems of power and belief that normalize certain forms of cruelty while rendering certain categories of people as legitimate subjects for exploitation. Today, the Montgomery house on Abercorn Street continues its silent vigil, bearing witness to a history that many would prefer to forget. For those who know its story, the elegant facade can never fully conceal the horrors that once occurred within its walls. For those who pass by unaware, it remains just another beautiful example of Savannah's architectural heritage. This duality, the simultaneous presence and absence of historical memory, characterizes many sites of historical trauma. It is in this tension between remembering and forgetting, between acknowledgement and denial, that we continue to negotiate our relationship with the most troubling aspects of our collective past. As the sun sets over Savannah, casting long shadows across Abercorn Street, the Montgomery house stands as it has for generations, elegant, imposing, and harboring secrets that whisper through time. For those who listen closely, those whispers tell not just of past horrors, but of the ongoing struggle to build a world in which such atrocities are impossible, a world in which the dignity of every human being is recognized and respected. That struggle continues today in Savannah and beyond, as we grapple with the legacies of a past that is never truly past. For the true horror of the Montgomery case lies not in ghostly hauntings or supernatural phenomena, but in the very human capacity for both cruelty and denial, and in the recognition that these capacities remain with us still. Perhaps that is why the story continues to resonate, why it refuses to be forgotten despite decades of official silence. It speaks to something fundamental about human nature and society, something we ignore at our peril. And so, as night falls over Savannah, As the sounds of tourists and traffic fade into the evening quiet, the Montgomery House stands as a silent witness to a history that demands to be remembered. Not as a sensational tale of ghostly hauntings, but as a sober reminder of real human suffering and of our collective responsibility to ensure that such suffering is neither repeated nor forgotten. For in remembering, in acknowledging, in facing the darkest chapters of our past, we take the first essential steps toward creating a more just and humane future.